NATO foreign ministers in Sweden seeking clarity from the United States over troop deployments and, of course, the US's larger commitment to the defense alliance.
Well, it is confusing, indeed, and not always easy to navigate. I guess you feel the same as I do.
A bewilderment from Sweden's top diplomat after US President Donald Trump announced 5,000 more troops being deployed to Poland. He had earlier called for the reduction of America's military footprint. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking to the press ahead of talks, stressing the need for closer cooperation and also that NATO must deliver benefits for all its members.
Good morning again.
Like any alliance, it has to be good for everyone who's involved. It has to be a clear understanding of what the expectations are. And so certainly we'll try to lay the groundwork for that. One of the areas where I think we definitely can cooperate on is the defense industrial base. It is clear to the world, to all of us in the alliance and beyond, that we simply are not able to produce munitions today at a rate that are necessary for future needs. That's something that has to be addressed. That's something that we can work together on. That's something we want to work together on. I think it's key not just to production, but to interoperability.
And Ross Cullen is covering this story for CNA from Paris. Ross, that bewilderment from Sweden's foreign minister, because we've seen chopping and changing from the Trump administration, first cutting troops stationed in Germany, then suspending or pausing for the moment troops on their way to Poland, and then saying there will be 5,000 more troops being sent to Poland. What clarity did European NATO members get from Marco Rubio?
Not much clarity, Wei Su, especially as Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is there to try to bring forward the policies of the Trump administration. And certainly there has been many opportunities for confusion over the last few months. If you do look at the pronouncements from the president on Truth Social, particularly on his social media platform, announcing 5,000 troops leaving Europe, 5,000 troops coming into Europe, changing the goalposts when it comes to the objectives of the Trump administration in terms of the war in Iran. Interesting to note Marco Rubio's opening comments, though, when he did say that he thought the upcoming NATO leaders summit in the Turkish capital in July would be one of the most important summits in NATO history. There, you're going to have the United States leader up face-to-face with NATO allies who he has said has disappointed him because they did not join in the war in Iran. Right now, at a ministerial level, the US Secretary of State face-to-face with others, including the German foreign minister, another NATO ally, Germany at the time, saying this is not our war, we didn't start it. And so the NATO members trying to provide a bit of clarity to the United States over why they did not join in the conflict with Iran.
Because Marco Rubio's point has been, why is the US in NATO if European allies did not join in the US's fight on Iran? How is the alliance, given its different approach or its priorities on Iran, going to be balancing the different interests so NATO can act, at least be perceived to act, as a unified whole?
Well, Wei Su, the United States Secretary of State, saying there has been a little bit of movement, and that's good. Marco Rubio giving some comments about Iran at the start of the meeting. The United States is the biggest member of NATO. The United States has the biggest military within NATO, and the defence budget dwarfs those of any other country inside or outside NATO. So it's certainly the crucial part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation infrastructure. They do want to see other members stepping up to the plate in terms of increasing the percentage of the GDP that they are spending on defence, and there have been some countries that have indeed been increasing their defence budgets, certainly after the pressure from the United States, but also in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So when it comes to the clarity overall and trying to balance the interests of the United States and the interests of NATO, there are other flashpoints, notably the United States opening a new consulate in Greenland, which is sovereign territory of another NATO member, Denmark. We don't need to go into the full story of what happened in January, but again, tensions there between Copenhagen and Washington. So lots of differences to try to work out at the foreign ministers' meeting.
Thanks, Ross Cullen. They're covering the story for CNA from Paris. And Nick Harper is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Nick, we're just speaking to Ross Cullen there in Paris. He remarked on Marco Rubio in his opening remarks, referring to Donald Trump's disappointment with NATO and how at the next summit in Ankara in July, Marco Rubio calling it one of the most important summits in the history of NATO, because it will be at this summit that European members of NATO will need to respond to Mr. Trump's disappointment with this alliance. What shape might that disappointment take?
Well, potentially, Wei Su, these latest comments don't massively change that US-NATO dynamic. We have, of course, seen under President Trump really years of the US being critical of NATO. And that criticism here is once again continuing and probably will continue all the way up to that Ankara summit in July. What it doesn't do, of course, is mend the rift between the US and the military alliance. There's really no attempt by the US to try and mend fences. So really just another example of the US driving that wedge between the two, going even deeper. So on the cards for that Ankara summit in July, potentially another uncomfortable summit. In the past, there's been problematic issues between the US and NATO, for example, around funding. Donald Trump initially wanted all the countries in NATO to contribute more, 2% to hit that target. Then he demanded them to up their funding to 5%. And the other big problem has been how countries have been supporting Ukraine. This year's summit in Ankara potentially could be held against the backdrop of a brand new conflict, Iran, assuming that that's still going on and it's not resolved. So Donald Trump has wanted the support of NATO. He initially wanted them to join the US fight against Iran. And of course, that didn't happen. So now we have another grievance for the US president to lord over the NATO line, something else to berate them for.
And one area in which Mr. Trump could berate them would be on troop deployment. So confusion, understandable confusion amongst European allies, that instead of not sending troops to Poland, he's saying he's adding 5,000 additional troops, US troops, going to Poland. So if we look at 75,000 to about 80,000 US troops stationed under NATO in Europe, 5,000, 4,000 is not a great deal. But do we know how many troops, if there's any reduction, what sort of reduction are we looking at in terms of US deployments in Europe?
I mean, we don't know, Wei Su, because there is so much confusion. There have been plenty of numbers thrown around in the last week. And as of Thursday afternoon, the new plan, as you mentioned, was to send 5,000 troops to Poland. Donald Trump announcing that. But that's a complete 180, a complete reversal of the plan that was to call off that planned deployment, because last week the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth said that he was stopping the deployment of around 4,000 troops to Poland. He said that was because of frustration with European allies. He said they had not stepped up when America needed them. On top of that, earlier this month, Donald Trump said he was pulling 5,000 troops out of Germany. That was after Chancellor Friedrich Merz said the US was being humiliated by Iran. So it's not clear where these 5,000 troops, now in theory going to Poland, will be coming from, and how that changes the calculation on the cancellation and the withdrawals that have been mentioned over the last few weeks. Clarity is needed. Marco Rubio may be able to provide that, but so far he has insisted that any decisions that the US takes are not punitive on NATO or any of the countries involved in it.
Thanks. Nick Harper there covering this story for CNA from Washington, D.C.